fourth biggest in the world. With this massive army, Saddam decided that he could maybe multiply his oil reserves if he popped down to invade this little tiny country of Kuwait, where there's also loads of oil. This sort of freaked the Saudis out. If Saddam, with his giant army, could grab Kuwait, what would stop him from marching right across this desert into Saudi Arabia? So there's this moment that it's like the moment of infamy of this whole thing, where Osama goes to the Saudis and he says,
"I volunteer as tribute."
He doesn't actually say I volunteer in tribute, that was Hunger Games.
I believe we have a volunteer.
But he effectively says, I have me and my battle-hardened men who can go in and fight against Saddam and defend the kingdom. And the Saudis are like, no, we're not gonna let this ragtag group of rebel fighters fight off the fourth largest army in the world. And Osama's like, well, we beat the Soviets. They're a big army with nuclear weapons and everything. And the Saudis are like, yeah, because you hid in the hills in caves in Afghanistan. Prince Sultan literally told bin Laden verbatim, quote, "There are no caves in Kuwait." And then he asks them, what will you do when he lobs the missiles at you with chemical and biological weapons? Osama's response, we will fight them with our faith. And the Saudis are like, awkward? Sorry, dude, Instead, the king met with somebody else that he thought would make a much better fit than bin Laden and his faith fighters. Dick Cheney had flown to Saudi Arabia the day after Saddam had invaded Kuwait. At this point, the bromance between the US and Saudi Arabia had cooled a little bit, as Saudi had gotten more and more flack for being in bed with the US. But even despite this, he told Cheney to come with as much force and as quickly as he could. And that is exactly what Dick Cheney did.
Ready and willing to employ all means necessary.
The US went insane here. They recruited 37 other countries, and then they sent more firepower in terms of ships and bombers and troops and all this stuff than you and I could ever imagine. It was insanity. And they totally crushed Saddam. Within a few weeks, they had pushed Saddam back and completely won over the hearts of the royals. The bromance is back in business. So now you have these Saudis that are beaming at the Americans for helping them fight off Saddam. And you have a bunch of bases that the US set up to mount this attack. Way more than before. The US came with all of this firepower and manpower and bases and artillery, and then they just sort of never left. Something that really pissed off a lot of Saudis who were very uncomfortable with US presence to begin with. But the guy who was most pissed off than anyone in the Middle East at this point? Osama bin Laden, who had not only been rejected by his own country, but then who got chosen instead? But the great Satan, the United States, a power that Osama had built his entire life fighting against. So Osama bin Laden starts to double down on his original mission. He leaves Saudi Arabia and begins coordinating very precise attacks that could really only be coordinated by a guy who was good at technical details of a construction company and who had lots of money to fund it. He carries out attacks against the United States all around the world. And by the late 90s, he starts planning the attack that would change our world forever.
We're setting up an ad hoc.
So this is just the first half of the story. What happens next is something that we're all kind of familiar with. In fact, I think we're all still kind of processing the US presence in the Middle East today and how that all went down. But it deserves taking a look at, and I'm not going to do that right now. I want to make a separate video for Iraq and Afghanistan and Israel and Iran and dive into each of these cases to show how the US presence in the Middle East is not just about oil. In fact, oil is becoming less and less of a vital aspect of the US presence as we have alternative sources of this sort of energy. Instead, our presence in the Middle East has become a fixture of how we think about foreign policy and how we think about the map. It's become so embedded in our military doctrine and in our foreign policy doctrine that it's proving to be really hard to think about how we could ever get out. Thank you everyone for watching this video. Man, the Middle East. The Middle East. It's a complicated place, and this is just a very broad overview. And like I said, I want to go deeper into each of these case studies because there's so much more to cover with each of these stories. Anyway, that is to come. Stay tuned for that. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Big fan of Skillshare, big fan of online learning. Skillshare is a giant repository of online courses where you can learn everything you can imagine, from animation to photography to videography to cooking to entrepreneurial skills, like so many amazing things on Skillshare. There's a class that just published on Skillshare by my friend Nathaniel Drew. It's about developing your own voice online, unleashing your creativity. This course is really great. Nathaniel's really good at communicating and expressing, and he has a really unique voice online, and he teaches everything he knows in this course, so you should definitely go check it out. For a limited time, those who use the link in my description get 2 months of Skillshare Premium absolutely free. No money, and you get 2 months of free Skillshare. So you could watch like dozens of courses in that time for free. And then after that, if you do the annual, it's like $10 a month, which is just like absurdly cheap. So go check out Skillshare, and thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I will see you all in the next one. See ya.